And we are live and together for another edition of the Entity Framework Community Stand-Up. And yes. So first thing is first, introduce the people on the show today. So I'm kicking things off. My name is Jeremy Lickness. I'm a program manager for .NET Data at Microsoft, and we have two guests with us today. First, Phil, you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Phil Japixi. I write a bunch of books. I do a lot of speaking, but I work full-time as a consultant and as an interim CTO for a large firm in Chicago. And I've been involved in .NET since the beginning, .NET Core since the very beginning, and I've been a fan of EF since it became a real product about midstream of the EF Classic cycle.
Nice. And Robert?
Hey, I'm Robert Green. I worked at Microsoft for many, many years in developer tools marketing and then also in various evangelism groups. I retired from full-time employment last October, but stuck around to keep hosting the Visual Studio Toolbox show, which I've been doing on Channel 9 since 2011, I believe. And then recently, Leslie Richardson has taken over as the primary host of that show, but I'm still involved as the PM. And when I'm not enjoying leisure time, I speak at conferences and dabble in all of the software we're talking about.
Yeah, I used to say I speak at conferences. That hasn't happened in quite some time, except for online. Shai?
Yeah, my name is Shai Wojanski. I'm an engineer on the EF Core team. I also do a lot of stuff, a lot of work with the Postgres database. I maintain the providers, both EF Core and ADO.NET. I have a certain focus on performance, but otherwise, just another engineer on the team.
Great. And Arthur?
I'm Arthur Vickers. I'm the engineering manager on Entity Framework, but basically just a coder.
Just a coder.
Yeah.
We didn't let him into the room, but Smit is on the call. He's just not in our stadium seating. Smit, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone. I'm Smit. I'm just engineer on this team. I mainly work in the area of query pipeline translation, all those weird failures.
Awesome. All right, well, let's get this kicked off with some community links. I'm going to share my screen, and we will go with the Inception view right here. All right, a few links for us today. I'm not going to click on this first one because it'll start playing a video. But this is a recent, we just had our .NET Conf for microservices. And it was I think it was actually like a full day of sessions, but Julie Lerman had a session on the intersection of microservices, domain-driven design, and Entity Framework Core. It's about a 30-minute session. Highly recommend taking a look at that. The second link here is the GitHub repo for her session. So it shows basically how to take the patterns that she talked about in that session and implement them in a small project. So something to check out, sort of a real-world Entity Framework Core, if you will. I don't know if anyone else either saw her session or has looked at the repo, has any comments or thoughts?
I took a quick look at it, and it looks great as always with Julie's stuff. I think whether or not you want to use all those domain-driven design patterns or not depends somewhat on personal preference. But there's some really good stuff there.
Well,
I think the important thing to note. I think the important thing to know is that you can use those patterns with EF Core, right? And that's a big change from where we have
gaps there too. Yes, we have support. I think we took some missteps in value object and aggregates in the past. But yes, in general, we look at DDD patterns as something we definitely want to support. Not because it's DDD necessarily, but just because they're useful patterns for anybody doing this kind of development, I think.
Sorry, I interrupted, Jeremy.
Oh, no, that's what this is about, discussion. and free-flowing conversation about how to call stored procedures with output parameters with from SQL Raw and EF Core, which is pretty much the blog post, I think. No. The very specific title, this is Eric. He blogs quite frequently tips and tricks and techniques about Entity Framework Core. He's author of the Power Tools. Definitely check those out. But this is basically showing you how to take this particular type of stored procedure and map it through Entity Framework Core.
Yep. This is really good stuff. Output parameters tend to be tricky because there's things that people don't necessarily understand that aren't very intuitive, such as having to enumerate the result set before the output parameter is populated. So some of these patterns that Eric shows are really useful and good for us to look at and discuss with Eric in terms of how we make the experience better without having to do some of these things.
Work around the workarounds.
Yeah.
And the next two links are just some new documentation, but we wanted to highlight that we're continuing to build on what we're calling our platforms experience. So that is making sure that we have the documentation and the support you need regardless of which platform you're using Entity Framework Core on. So this is a new getting started with EF Core and Xamarin link. You can see it's right here in the documentation. In fact, if you land on our main page, we've got supported platforms right down here, and you can drill into the different documentation related to those. This walks through creating an EF Core and Xamarin app. And it's fairly simple. It's got blogs and posts, but it shows you how to query and update and post new data. So definitely check that out. There's a sample that you can clone for that. Any thoughts on EF Core on Xamarin?
Not specifically, but it's really great to see these different platforms coming forward, and not just all ASP.NET. Obviously, a lot of people use ASP.NET Core, but we've designed EF Core from the beginning to work on different platforms. So it's really good to get better support. And we had great help from the Xamarin CAD team on this for creating this content. We've really tried to work with the other teams to make sure we're giving the correct guidance there. Yes,
that's one thing that was. I'm glad you called that out, because the other teams internally have been incredibly helpful in helping us develop this documentation, and also just make sure a lot of platforms have different conventions. There's different things you have to be concerned with. For example, on a mobile, there's a very, you're on a much smaller device, more constrained resources. So there's some caveats to coding on those platforms, and we're thankful that we have teams to collaborate with who are experts in those areas and can give us that information. The other thing I want to point to is we've had an issue for some time on WPF for .NET Core. So we do have an example of WPF on the .NET framework, but this is getting started with WPF on .NET Core and walks you through building a similar application. It's actually products, categories, and products example, but it'll show you all of the different steps that you need to take, and it's also linked to a repo. And then we had a question in chat about plans for WinForms equivalent, and the answer is yes. I am working on a WinForms equivalent for this documentation. Right now, the designer for .NET Core doesn't have all of the functionality that some of our existing tutorials had with, for example, creating and dragging data sources. That doesn't mean it won't work with WinForms. There's just some other steps involved, and so I'm working through the best practices and guidance for that. But we will have WinForms come out. We will also have guidance for Blazor server applications, and that will include a sample project, should come out in the next few weeks is what the timeline's looking like. But that is a sample project that's a pretty in-depth project. And by in-depth, I mean it's got a grid that you can sort, you can insert, you can update, you can delete. So it should be a pretty comprehensive list. Any other?
Hey, Jeremy, can I jump in?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
On the WPF side, we've been using EF Core with WPF since 1.1. Since EF Core 1.1. it's something that we switched over, and we'll talk about later on this show about the performance. But yeah, so it's been going great. And then my latest book, which I am no wrong hand because it's backwards. Anyway, my C# 8 book, I've got an entire chapter on WPF with EF Core Resolve 3.1 using NVVM. So it fully implements NVVM pattern with EF Core.
Nice.
That's very cool. It's really good to hear that because, like I said, from the beginning of EF Core, even though we were kind of going along with ASP.NET Core, and that's our main partner, and still most people using EF Core are using ASP.NET Core, we tried to build in like the data binding and the WPF and the WinForms and all of the stuff that we learned from the classic EF build into the APIs on the new EF, but with a much better implementation. So it's great to hear that you've been using that stuff successfully.
Yeah, and now that we have the field mapping built in for the backing fields, it makes it that much better, right? It took away a bunch of workarounds that we had to do for NVVM.
Yes.
And it's just super clean now.
And we have in EF Core 5, we have a community contribution that implemented change tracking proxies. Now the change tracking proxies are not without their challenges, but it means that basically you can now have us create dynamic proxies which implement I notify property changing and I notify property changed for you, so you don't have to do that. And then we respond to all those events. So that can be useful if you want those things implemented automatically as well.
So I just want to give a shout out to the docs. I mean, we've been in this business for a long time, most of us, and the docs were always there's this thing over there, it's the docs, you'd never point people to it. You might go over there to learn about a particular property or method, more of a reference, but you never went to the docs to learn how to use things. And now that's the first place I go, and it's been like that for quite some time. You go to the docs and you just showed us a couple tutorials of how to get started and start from scratch and do something and build something, and there's the repo sitting in GitHub, and that's the great place to start now. It's just so refreshing and never tire of marveling about it and shouting it out anytime I get a chance. So awesome work there.
Appreciate that. I think as docs is a never-ending task, we have more docs to do all the time. But it's one of those things that I think the value is being increasingly recognized within Microsoft, which does not mean that it wasn't before. But I think maybe in the .NET Core timeframe, some of the docs kind of lagged behind, and now that's really coming back, and we're putting really good docs everywhere we can. But it's challenging because we don't really have the same kind of doc teams that we used to have, 10 years ago. So basically, if we're going to write good docs, then somebody out on the EF team has to spend time writing those things. And we have people to help with the editing and the grammar and that kind of stuff, but we have to write the content. So it's a great example of where we have to draw the balance between, okay, we haven't implemented this feature, but we've very well documented these other things so people can actually use it, and it's a challenge to get that balance right, but we do our best.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited just about the platform that was built around docs here. If anyone's contributed to or used the for example, with those getting started articles, you see all those code snippets and highlights, and I don't even have to copy and paste code. I'm actually referencing the sample directly, so as the sample changes, the code snippets change, and it's just little things like that make it incredible, and that it's open source. So anyone listening to this who has a correction that they think should be made, they can submit a pull request, and we can review that, make sure it meets our standards, and pull it in. So, and we recognize people quite frequently on the NVD Framework Core updates for contributions to documentation. Before I jump to the next link, we do have a question in chat. Were owned entities motivated by a demand to add domain-driven design value object support to Entity Framework?
So I don't know. That feels like there's a plant there somewhere. But I could spend the next hour answering that question, but I'm not going to. I would say that we had a lot of very passionate discussions around how to support the equivalent of complex types in EF6 and before. And one of those options was, okay, so also at the same time, we know we want to support very good support for DDD aggregates concept, which we haven't finished yet, but we were considering starting a couple of years ago. And there was a proposed design, which is essentially, if we do own types which are aggregates, then we can also use those to essentially simulate the behavior of complex types, which are kind of like value objects. So it's kind of one of those things where it's I think there's the concept of the lumpers who want to put everything together into one thing that just does everything for everything. It's a single abstraction, and the splitters who are like, that's a different thing from this, and this needs to be a different abstraction. So we kind of went on the lumpers path here. I think in retrospect, and with feedback, it wasn't correct, and we should have just had aggregates, own types be aggregates, which is what they really are supposed to be, and we should have done a different implementation of value objects. However, at the time, we were considering an implementation of value objects that look like complex types, and I think we've learned since then that that's not really the way to go, and really the way to go is to enhance the value converters we have, because effectively when you use a value converter, you make your property in your model act like it was just some other property, and all you care about is how the serialization and things like that may be different. So split to multiple columns, for example. That's a much better fit. So in the future, we're looking to implement support for value objects like that, and then continue the design for own types to cover the real aggregate behaviors that was the original intention of own types.
All right.
Hopefully that makes sense.
An hour condensed into a few minutes. I love it. All right, let's jump on this last link because it ties directly to, you probably see a couple familiar faces right there, Phil and Robert. And,
and evidently I only own one shirt.
Yeah.
Oh wait, is that the case? Oh
It's the
yeah.
same shirt.
Shirts. Look at that.
One of my Doctor Who shirts. So.
Well, Scott Good only has
keep...
one shirt, so.
Well, that's true. Well, I bet he has a closet full, but they're all the same.
Oh, it's not the same one.
So yeah, you might have a rack with 5 copies of the same shirt, right? That would be one way to do it. So this is the Entity Framework Core in-depth series, and this is why we brought this team on, because this series just came out. And as you can see, there's multiple parts. There's a focus on performance, view models, configuration, so on and so forth. I won't read all of the parts, but it's a very in-depth series, and there's some interesting motivations behind why it was created. And also just both of these gentlemen have plenty of experience that they bring to the table with actually using Entity Framework Core. So why don't I start with a question for Robert and Phil on exactly what was your motivation behind, let's try not to hit the Windows key here while I'm multitasking. What was your motivation behind creating this course? Let's start with that.
So the basic motivation behind the whole Visual Studio Toolbox show, which is on Channel 9 and also YouTube, is that, when I started it, I thought, what should the name be? And I've always viewed, they're called developer tools for a reason, and they're tools because you build things. And if you think about Visual Studio, it's just this giant toolbox of various tools, and some of the tools are IDE. I view the language as the tool. I view .NET as a tool. I view anything you do, whether it's a designer or a wizard or code you write, as a tool you're using, because at the end, you're building an application. So the whole show has always been about the tools you can use to build apps. So some episodes are about what you literally think of tools, performance tools or refactorings or whatever. But we've also done lots of episodes on things like C# or VB or .NET. Now, the on .NET show is also came around, and so a lot of the .NET frameworky, languagey type things are on that show. But we don't say that you can only do .NET on .NET show and you can't do .NET on the Toolbox show. So I looked, think about EF Core as a tool you use inside an application to work with data. So we decided that, it was time to talk about Entity Framework. We hadn't talked about it for a while. So Phil and I, we had done series before. We did a series on testing. We did a series on design patterns. So we said we should do another series, and we picked EF Core because we think there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of knowledge, a lot of people who maybe haven't thought about it in a while. Maybe they played with Entity Framework a while ago, but they haven't really played with Core. So we started out with an intro series, a 5-part intro series on EF Core. And then after that, followed up with the in-depth series where we picked 10 specific topics. And again, the whole idea is to provide another way for people to learn how to use EF Core and then how to make the most out of it. And Phil was, awesome and gracious in his time, agreeing to do what wound up being 15 episodes altogether.
Yeah, and the intro that we did first, those first 5 episodes, that was really what is EF Core, right? How do you spell EF? What is a context? What is a table? What is a navigation property? Because I wanted to lay that foundation before we start talking about, why EF Core is so much better than EF and why EF Core should be part of your toolbox for certain things, right? Certainly if you're building a reporting app, EF Core isn't the right tool. But if you're building forms over data, EF Core is absolutely the right tool. And there's, as Robert said, there's so many misconceptions. I'll be at a conference. I do a lot of full-day workshops and on ASP.NET Core and EF Core, and I'll have people, ping me beforehand. It's like, oh, you're doing a morning of EF Core. Can I just come for the afternoon when you talk about ASP.NET Core? And I'm like, well, no, because you're going to be behind. And the hands-on labs require you to be, on time. And, oh, by the way, why don't you want to come to EF Core? Well, it's slow. My boss won't let me use it. The DBAs hate it, right? All of these non-technical, well, slow is a technical reason, but it's wrong. But all these non-technical reasons that people come up with, I'm like, you know what? You're at the conference anyway. Just spend a half day. And invariably, people come up to me afterwards, and they're like, we had no idea that EF Core has come this far and it can be this helpful for what we're trying to accomplish. So, and that's really the, that's why we kicked it off with performance, right? I hear all the time EF Core is slow, or they'll say EF is slow. And I'll be like, all right, if you're talking about EF Classic, the early versions, I'm going to give you that. It was slow, right? It might have sped up parts of your development, but as a runtime, it kind of sucked. And there's reasons for that. But EF Core, one of the things I always point out, and that's why I'm so thrilled about the whole .NET Core ecosystem, is prior versions of .NET, ASP.NET, right? They had goals, and the goals didn't really include performance initially. They were trying to meet an objective, however you can get her done, right? And so they got it done, and then when performance started to matter, because now we're going to the cloud or now we're distributed systems, right? If you think about early on, everything was client server. Nobody cared about performance because you had your entire computer to do the processing. And then, 8 years down the road, you're looking at EF6, scratching your head going, we can't change it, right? We're locked in. If we change this, we break everybody. So the decision, and I'm not speaking for Microsoft, I'm not a Microsoft employee, these are my opinions, but I believe the decision was made, you know what, let's go ahead and break everybody, which is what .NET Core did, right? But this is our brass ring, right? How many people are listening to the show right now? Go back and look at code you wrote a week ago, 3 weeks ago, a year ago, and go, holy crap, I could have done that so much better, right? This was the opportunity for all the teams, and the EF Core team especially, to go back and say, what is our foundation? What are we trying to accomplish, right? What is our sprint goal? Let's figure that out, and let's write code to match that as opposed to some other random goal. And I rejoiced when I heard that the designer was not coming back into EF Core. I think I danced a little bit. Because almost every time I talk to somebody who's using EF Classic and I say, what is your biggest problem? And they say performance. I said, are you using the designer? And they said, yes. I'm like, okay, well, there you go, right? You can draggy droppy, but now your performance is going to be out to crapper, right? And so I guess that's really my motivation is to spread the love, right? Because EF Core has come so far.
Yeah. And I think not just EF Core, but like you say, the whole of the .NET Core movement, if you like, which obviously started in various ways in various different parts, but EF Core was definitely very much part of the Project K system that was the starting point in the ASP.NET Core, which David Fowler and other people worked on, and from the beginning we were in lockstep with them with the same goals of high performance, modern, extensible, open source, allow the community ecosystem to plug things in. We have brilliant providers for Postgres and MySQL now because the community is able to write them and run our tests and test them and ship them. Whereas in AF6, you had some other providers for them, but because it was all based around SQL Server, they weren't very useful. So there was all of these goals that aligned with EF Core and Project K, which all became .NET Core and now .NET 5, and it's awesome. It's reinvigorated the platform. The platform now is modern and fast and getting faster and better all the time, which is awesome.
Well, and I think when you make performance part of your definition of done, right, as opposed to say, hey, we need this feature. We need a better many-to-many story. Let's just get something out there so people stop complaining. And then we'll go back and fix it later. Well, you never go back and fix it later, right? I mean, if you're a real world dev, you write something, you're moving on to the next thing, and you look back and go, ew, that's stinky. Oh, well, I don't have time.
Yeah, so we have performance tests that run continually basically on every check-in. And twice a week in our weekly triage meetings, we look through all of the results, and if there's any regression, and in fact, if you follow along on the GitHub repo, you'll see us file these issues, and it'll be a little graph in there that says, hey, look, we regressed the perf on this thing, and then somebody goes and looks at it, and basically we fix the perf. So obviously, as always, we need more of those tests, and there's so many different variations and in EF Core that you can do that we don't have enough testing there. But from a philosophical and a process perspective, like we care that the perf doesn't regress, and we care that we make it faster when we can.
Well, and it's not just the perf of EF Core itself, right? It's the brains behind the link to SQL Translation Engine, right? I remember early on in Core, a friend of mine who's a hardcore DBA, right? Certified and store procedure, everything. And I said it was, it wasn't that early because I didn't want to do it early. I think it was a 2.1 time frame. I said, okay, let's look at your database. Let me write some, let me reverse engineer a database. You get everything set up, and let's run some queries using EF Core, and let's open up Profiler, and you tell me how we can make these better. And he looked at him and went, huh, oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And it shut him up.
One of the other goals we've had in EF Core is to write simple readable SQL, to generate simple readable SQL. Obviously efficient as well, but not just efficient. Also, kind of where we can, efficiency trumps this, but where we can, we want to generate SQL like you would have written it. And not make the argument, oh, the query compiler in SQL Server or whatever is going to just optimize that all to the same thing anyway, which may have been true and was true in a lot of cases, but different providers optimize differently for one thing. And secondly, you want to be able to have it, like you say, pass it to somebody who knows SQL and say, is this what you would have written? And if they say no, then you're like, okay, well, what should we do then? Because that's not ideal if we're writing different SQL.
Yeah, I have to interject on this. Like one small point on this. I remember that there were some days when people would say, "Oh, you're using an ORM. SQL is basically your assembly, right? It's like somebody is compiling your code for you. You're not supposed to care about what comes out, right? You're supposed to care about it working." And I think so. I did used to interact with EF and the old stack and EF6 and so on. And if you look at the SQL that gets generated there, That is the way it looks like. It looks like a bit of assembly that if you know SQL, you're not necessarily going to be able to parse, especially if you're looking at some of the more complex patterns, TPT and things like this. You're not actually going to understand. This is like a blob of assembly that you're looking at. And EF Core, one of the things I personally like a lot as an engineer on the team as well, but also as a user, if you look at the actual SQL, you should not be scared to look at it, and it is fine. And as anybody who is using a database knows, at the end of the day, if performance is something that you do care about, you should be looking at least a little bit at your SQL, at those queries, and EF Core makes that actually possible when compared to previous versions of this. That's a very strong point.
To add to that and to a comment on the chat here, in EF Core 5.0 we have the two query string API, so you can now in a debug view you can hover over your iQuery, you can see what SQL we generate, print it out, so it's easier to see that information than it was even. We had logging before, you could always log it, but now you don't need to run it, you can just get it without logging.
And to be clear, you could, as long as you didn't have more than one include, you could get the SQL out. It was a bit of a hack,
Yes.
But that's a really nice feature that brought back. And that was something that was an EF Classic that finally made it in the EF Core,
Yes.
where you could get the actual query out. Looking at the comments going by, and somebody is a fan of Dapper. And if Dapper works better for you, then use it, right? Nobody on this call is saying you have to use EF Core. I mean, yes, it has issues, right? The N+1 issue, which has been resolved. There are some missing features that honestly made 1.1 very difficult to use in a non-web world. 2.1, I think the features were there where I could use it, universally for web and WPF. 3.1 brought in even more features, and 5, I'm looking forward to actually seeing 6 because I'm really hesitant to use a current version versus LTS. But yeah, I mean, it keeps getting better.
I'd like to actually ask you about that a little bit. It's interesting you say that because more and more it feels to me like, certainly on the team, and when people are interested in getting the new EF Core stuff, we're pushing people to use the daily builds, which is about as far as you can go to the opposite direction of using the LTS. And the reason we do that is that, I mean, essentially, this wasn't true in EF Core 3, because in EF Core 3, we did the whole, query rewrite. So things were broken while we were doing the previews, but that's not the normal case. Normally, all of our tests run on every build that we do. If you break the build, which doesn't happen frequently, then you got to fix it immediately. So basically, our daily, all you get when you take a release version is we put a stamp on one of those daily builds essentially and said that's the release version. It's not inherently any better. So I'm curious as to your reasoning to wait for not only a release but an LTS.
So I work mostly I've done a bunch of manufacturing, but I don't do it as much anymore, but mostly healthcare and legal. Yeah. And when you're looking at website compliance, if you're using unsupported software, you're automatically out of compliance. Mm-hmm. You'd be surprised. Maybe you should come to one of my workshops one time, because when I go through the whole licensing confusion and the versioning confusion,
yes,
somebody will drop the F-bomb when I talk about 2.2 being unsupported.
We screwed that up.
And so these people are on 2.2 and they're going, I'm like, you're out of support, right? I mean, what does that mean? Well, it might mean nothing to you, but for my customers, that is a checkbox that the regulators look at. Yes. So I'm not going to 5. I will play with it. I will talk about it. I'll write about it, but I'm not going to recommend my customers go to 5 for a couple of reasons. If they go to 5 and Microsoft stamps a 5.1, that means 5.0 is out of support in 3 months after 5.1, right? And so we've got that whole dance going on, whereas I would rather just tell my customers, hey, stay on the LTSs, and, we can look at and we can prototype and we can think about these, but your mission critical apps have to be on an LTS, because nobody has the bandwidth to suddenly say, oh, shoot, it's been 3 months. We have to upgrade all of our apps and get them retested and re-released.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'll say though that the leaving people in the lurch with the 2.2 thing, that's known and discussed across, not the EF team, but the wider, .NET org as being something that we want to avoid doing. That it's caused various problems for customers and us internally. We won't want to do that. Our current plan is not to do any point releases between .NET 5 and .NET 5 and .NET 6, basically. So EF Core 5 and EF Core 6 as well. Such that we'll have the 5 version out there for a full year, and then the next LTS version will replace it. And that's kind of aligns with the published yearly cadence on the .NET roadmap. So hopefully it won't be quite as bad as the 2.2 situation, but your points are valid. I'll say one more thing on this, though. One of the reasons that people want to be on supported versions, obviously, is to get security fixes when they come in. But since we already always put security fixes into the main branch, as it were, basically at the same time. It might be slightly after, but basically at the same time as they go into a release. It's actually a very good way of getting those security fixes quickly too. So understanding there's regulatory things and you have to have supported software, but if you're in a place where you can use daily builds, I would say that's something you should look at, depending on your domain and everything. Yeah, and what I tell everybody is just, go out, I put the link on the page for the versions and when they're expiring and everything else. I said, just bookmark this page and make sure that before you make a decision, when you do file a new project, look at that page before you. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's very good, very wise advice.
Just to add like a very, very small thing. So one of the points with 2.2 is mainly that 3.0 was such a big change and upgrading from 2.2 was such a difficult thing for our customers, which I think is the real source of the issue that happened with 2.2. So basically, if you're saying to yourself, I might go to 5.0, but I'm scared about what happens later, we're definitely no longer intending to do any sort of version that's going to be as difficult to upgrade to as it was for 3.0. So basically, if you're okay with doing the upgrade to 6.0 1 year later after 5.0, then there's much less of a risk than there was before to getting stuck in the lurch in that sense. Of course, you still have to commit, assuming you want to stay on supported versions, you still have to somewhat commit to doing that upgrade to 6.0 rather quickly. But at least what we can assure people is that it's not going to be as difficult as it was upgrading from 2.2 to 3.0. And I think that's a big part of the story of what was more difficult in that sense.
Yeah, and it's not a technical decision. It's a legal, regulatory, business decision that has to be made, right?
Yeah,
sure.
As a diehard geek, obviously wearing a Doctor Who shirt, I always want to be on the latest and greatest.
Yeah.
But I also, run a business and have customers that have to answer to other people, and so I can't just say, "Hey, this is cool. This daily build has this thing in it. Let's use it."
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely not pushing back on what you're saying at all. But there are first-party services in Microsoft that are running on at least preview. Sometimes they switch to daily builds of .NET Core all up, and I don't know if I'm allowed to name them, so I won't because I don't want to get in trouble here. But they're big things that everybody's heard about, and they run on because if you can do that and you don't have the regulatory concerns and the business concerns, it's in the modern environment where we do build, we do have continuous integration going, we do ship those builds, we are very responsive to, hey, we broke you, we can put a fix in there and get it out basically the same day. It's a path that I think people should consider when they can, that's all.
Yeah, and I'm not, again, it's not a technical thing, right?
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that you need to know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And people with 2.2 didn't know. They thought, 2.2 is greater than 2.1, I should upgrade. And didn't realize the whole licensing thing.
Yes.
But this is not the EF Core licensing show, so we should
move
back
on.
to
I was actually going to ask you there's a lot of episodes, right? 10 of them. On the performance episode, was there anything that you covered that people in general may be surprised to hear, might not know, some tip or feedback or insight?
Yeah. So let me share my screen. And let me just give a little background to this. So one of our customers in the 1.1 frame, so way back when, they had a website that was very slow. And it was the number one complaint for their users was the performance, the lack of performance of their website. And so I was brought in, my team and I were brought in to look at it. And what we realized was that there was no way we were going to fix the architecture of this website. The performance, the number of performance complaints, if you took numbers 2 through 10 in the order of complaints, added them all together, it didn't equal the number of complaints they got on performance. So realizing we didn't have the budget or the time to fix it, what I did was simply swap out EF6 with EF Core. This was an MVC 5 app, full framework, which EF Core obviously at that time and still mostly with caveats can run on .NET Classic. And so we had our EF6 project in there. We had our EF Core project in there. And the heavy hitters, the queries that were called most, same models, right? We had to tweak some of the attributes and use Fluent API on both sides to make it work. Same models, EF6 or EF Core 1.1 queries, we released that. The performance complaints dropped out of the top 10.
Wow.
So that's real world evidence. What I have here, and this is Jeremy, I know it's Robert, it's on our show notes, the link to the code, but I've got a project here that all it does is call into 2 other projects and runs a series of things. Let's talk about those things. So I've got EF 6.1 through 6.4.4. So the .NET Coreified version of EF6, and that's not truly a rewrite. That's just core support.
That's just
bolted
porting.
into
That
it.
same code, yeah.
Yeah. And then I've got 3.1.6 for EF Core. And it's going against AdventureWorks on my machine. Now, I've got a pretty decent machine, 32 gig of RAM. It's 16 cores. So it's not slow, SSD, right? But no network latency, no other things out about it. So let me run this, and I'll get this warmed up on a different screen because it's just a console app. Calling both systems 3 times, where I call, get 17,000 records. I think it's 19,000 records. All these things that you shouldn't do when you're using an ORM, by the way. I'm doing a lot of them just to show the magnitude. And then once it's done, which it's almost done now, we'll just go through the results. It's going to bounce a little bit. So can you see my screen okay? Is that font big enough? I think it is. Okay.
The console font's good. The code font you might want to bump up when you're showing code again.
Okay, I will do that. Yeah, so it's going to jump until it's done. So one of the big changes that came with EF Core is this whole concept of batching. So let me talk about the batching process. With EF6, if you had 10 changes, right, to change the DB change tracker is tracking what changed, right? That's one of the beauties of using it as a developer is you don't have to track all those things. And you call save changes on the DB context. So the DB context then asks the change tracker, hey, what do I have to do? And the change tracker says, oh, you've got these changes. So those changes are then sent to the link translation engine or the SQL translation engine, and the SQL is generated to do those. In EF6, there was a whole lot of chattiness going on back and forth between EF6 and your database, which is fine if your server is sitting on a blade in a server room in your, data center, and your web server is right next to the database server. But we're really talking about a lot of distributed systems now. A batch is, and you can configure the batch size, but I tell everybody not to because some wicked smart people, and some of them are on this call, figured out what the optimal batch size should be, but it sends over the code in a batch. And so uses some SQL trickery to, instead of sending these 10 things as chatty responses, it sends them over as one batch. So you're using the power of the server and not being limited by the chattiness between where the server is, the database server, and where your web server or whatever is running this code exists. So let's look at the numbers. So I'm querying 19,000 records out of AdventureWorks This is EF64, so it took about a second, half a second for core, so about a 50% improvement. Now, if you're querying 19,000 records from an ORM, you're probably doing it wrong, so you might want to think about that. There is a concept in EF Core where you can say, I want it to be untracked. So you're telling EF Core, please don't take this thing, put it don't have the DB tracker track it. So it's just an entity that's in your context. And this is great for example, if you're building a website, the get methods will never do an update, so you can send them as untracked, right? The post is where you need to worry about the updates. But look at the perf differences. And for EF6, it's the same thing. The numbers are just whether it's warmed up or not. But we're down to 0.1 seconds for pulling back 19,000 records untracked. We can also use a query type. Now, I will say that I do have a beef with the EF Core team because you changed the DB query type to a DB set that we now have to use the Fluent API. That makes it that much harder for the next person looking at your code to know what your intentions were.
Yes. So, I mean, did we add an attribute for has no key? We did, right? In 5.0?
In 5.
Yes. Okay,
yes.
so we have at least done that.
Yes, but then I still have to look at the model as opposed to looking anyway.
Honestly, I think the main problem with QueryType is we gave you something, we took it back. And it's funny because on the team after we'd done it and we shipped and everything, and then we're re-talking about it, like, why did we do that? Why, you're just talking about how you look back at old code and you say, I could do that better now. So we look back at QueryType and we tried to figure out why we thought that was a good idea. And it really wasn't, I don't think, but because we'd given it you and made it easy, then taking it back made people upset. But I think it was the right decision.
There's some things that you gave us that you took back that were smart, like the mixed query execution, which was a mistake from the beginning.
Yes.
But the query type I liked because it made the code more readable. But anyway.
Yes.
So
anyway.
Query type is you're telling.
I think just to finish this thought, I think this is one of the challenges we have with .NET moving forward and with .NET Core becoming .NET 5, and that is if we stick to rigid compatibility, then we end up in a place like .NET Framework where we can't evolve it anymore. It is what it is, and anytime you change it, you break too many people to change it. So, it's not the same as .NET Framework because we're doing side-by-side releases. And so we are able to make some changes, but we have to be very conscious of the impact that those changes have. And as Shai was saying, the 3.0 release for EF Core was very impactful, but we're very much conscious that we need to be much more careful with breaking changes going forward.
So it means you're putting DB query type back in? Is that what I hear?
No, it's gone now. That would be. It's too late. That ship has sailed. On the other hand, we are in general, not just for EF, but across .NET Core, trying to sail this balance basically between evolve the framework where it needs to evolve, but not break people, or if you break them, make it super, super easy for them to unbreak themselves, which is really typically people don't mind if you say, okay, rebuild your application and change this method call. If you say rebuild this application and that functionality is gone and there's no way to do it, or it's very hard to do it, then that's when people get upset, which is right, and they should do.
So query type in EF Core is you're setting it up from the beginning. This will never be tracked. I'm never going to do updates. I'm never going to do deletes. I'm never going to do changes, right? I just need to read this data into an object model or into my object graph. And you can see that the performance, this is now EF Core versus EF Core, and the query type typically performs a little better. It's close, right? We're talking milliseconds. So a complex query, this is an interesting one, and I did not warm it up ahead of time. You can do some pre-compilation of queries. And what I mean by complex query, this is just something that has like a gazillion joins, right? So it's not truly complex. Prior to 3.1, the numbers weren't as good, but you can see once it's warmed up, it actually goes amazingly fast. So that's something you should look at with the pre-compilation features that's built in.
Yeah, so it's interesting on that because, there's the query has multiple phases like you're saying. So the query compilation, which typically only happens once because we cache it, is something that we haven't focused too much time on doing the perf improvements on yet. That it's not that we would like to do that, but that's probably why you're seeing the query compilation, obviously on the first iteration, be vastly different from the other ones after we've done the caching, and it's faster. But we'll get at some point, we'll get to make the compilation faster at some point, and also in some future version allow much better pre-compiled queries, potentially using the Roslyn code generators to pre-generate some stuff as you're building your project, rather than us dynamically doing it the first time we see your query, for example. So we have thoughts in that direction.
Yeah, and you can do some pre-compilation now. I just didn't for this demo.
There's a compile query API. You can use it. It's generally not that useful. Generally, the auto-compile queries is fine for most people, but yeah.
So this demo was so important, I wanted to call it twice. But anyway, so this is adding 1,000 records and calling save changes, and this shows the batching in full. So we've got 19 seconds, 16, almost 17 seconds, and 14 seconds to save 1,000 records with EF6, and we're less than a second, less than right around a quarter of a second on down, and that's kind of how I kick off all my EF core talks. And I just realized we chatted for a long time. This show's almost over because I wanted to get to Robert as well. But yeah, so if you are hesitant to move to EF core because you had a nasty experience with EF classic, try EF core, right? That's the long and short of it. And you probably will if you're watching this show. So I'm preaching to the choir a little bit. But one of the things that we went through these 15 episodes, Robert and I, and he had some exposure to EF core. So I know Robert had some things he wanted to talk about coming out of these shows that he had never tried before. And, Robert, why don't you tell us about your experience after doing the shows?
Yeah, so just anecdotally, one of the reasons I loved doing this series is because I had an app that I wanted to write. It's a Xamarin app, and it was going to call a web service, and I had a previous version of it in ASP.NET and Entity Framework sitting up in Azure. And so this was an opportunity to rewrite it in core. I made some minor changes to the database, but then rewrote the service, and anecdotally saw what I thought was an order of magnitude improvement in performance. Awesome. Working with basically the same data, a small data set, but just demonstrably quicker. So I didn't necessarily do perf testing, but just from eyeballs, it went from being, oh my God, this is slow, to, oh, that's pretty usable. I wonder how I can make it a little bit faster, which is an order of magnitude improvement. So it was much faster, and it just worked on 3.1. In terms of some of the features, and this was another thing I loved about the series, we did an episode on view models and projections, which I then used in the app. And then we did one on global query filters. And the interesting thing about this was it actually forced me to think about application design. So, let's say you're doing a to-do app or a task app. As soon as you mark something as complete, do you delete it, or do you mark it as complete and let it sit around in the database? And then if you're going to let it sit around in the database, then all your queries, you need to add a where clause where completed equals false if you want to see all the tasks that are outstanding. And so Phil showed the global query filter where you could basically make that as the default. Now you don't have to add it to all your queries. It's a really simple feature. It was very easy to implement. But I then spent, for this particular app, days thinking about, do I want to delete the data? Do I want it to stick around? What are the use cases? What are the questions you could ask if you actually had access to that previous data? And would you ever actually ask those questions? So, if it's a to-do app, I want to know what are the tasks that are due to me, and any task that I've already completed, well, that's ancient history, right? Well, is it ancient history? Would I ever go back and say, what percentage of tasks have been assigned to me versus assigned to my wife? What percentage of tasks, what percentage of the hard tasks have been assigned to me? What percentage of the tasks that were assigned to me were delivered late, right? So a lot of questions you can ask if you actually had the data, but would you ask those questions? Or do you just want to you just want to have insurance because a year from now someone's going to ask those questions and you can't answer them because you deleted all the data. So it really forced me to sit and think about the application itself, and it wound up being a really interesting design exercise. The feature itself is pretty much a no-brainer to implement, but I spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted the app to do.
Well, and the good news that, that whole thinking that you went through, that's all providing additional value to the business or your relationship in this case, right? So you can pull up the app and say, look, Colette, I did 200 tasks, you did 5, right? It's your turn.
You've met my wife. You know the conversation would never go like that.
Yeah, I know. She's wonderful, by the way. Certainly the better half.
Clearly.
But you can make those decisions, and a lot of that hardness, concurrency, right? Concurrency support. People don't think about concurrency, right? What if Robert and I are working on the same thing and we want to save it? And I save it first and then he tries to save it. Well, the beauty, and I don't have time to actually run this, but let me just look at, I'm going to show you my exception here. So you can automatically have EF Core throw a DB update concurrency exception if somebody tries to update a record after somebody else has updated it. In SQL Server, it uses a row version. I'm trying to talk quick because I know we have a time. But the good news is then it exposes those entries that failed the concurrency check. I can get the original values that I had when I pulled this record from the database. I can look at the current values. This is what I changed it to. I can use all kinds of link variations to figure out what I modified. If I want to make another database call, it's important I call this out. This is a database call, but then I can get the current values from the database. So then I can put a screen up saying, well, here's what's currently in the database. Here's what it was when you loaded it. Here's what it is that you try to change it to. And then, do some UI so I can pick and choose. Or I can programmatically say, Robert changed field A. I changed field B. I can see that it's not truly a field level concurrency issue. It's a row level concurrency. So I'm going to silently save this. The user's never going to know there was a problem because there wasn't, right? And we get that for
problem, right? It leads to an interesting discussion. Is that a problem?
Yeah.
Right? You changed the record. You saved it. I came in after that and changed it. I win, right? I can change whatever I want.
Exactly.
The fact that we hit save at the exact same time, does that really matter? It's an interesting question.
We've had those discussions about does it really matter a lot on the team.
I know.
Especially when Diego was, still the PM, because he felt very strongly, people should be using optimistic concurrency. I'm putting words in your mouth. I apologize, Diego, if you didn't exactly say that. But, felt people should be checking for this kind of thing. But what we found is a lot of customers will actually say, I don't care. Like, last one wins. That's it. Fine.
I believe in pessimistic concurrency.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Like, you have these features, but whether or not they make sense for your particular business, problem depends on what it is. But it's great to be able to do it.
For my teams that I run, there are 2 absolute must-haves that every project has to use. So every entity is going to have a timestamp. We're turning it on everywhere. Now, what the business decides to do with it is up to the business, right? The other thing that we turn on automatically is connection resiliency because we get that for free, right? And those are very seldom do I say you have to do something or you should never do something or you will never do something. But those are 2 things that we turn on. Now, what the business decides to do if there is a concurrency issue, that's a business problem, right? But EF Core makes it very simple. And for those watching who've never used this, This changes the link or the SQL so that if I have a timestamp marked or a concurrency field marked, instead of just saying update blog where ID equals 5, it says update blog where ID equals 5 and timestamp equals, it's a byte array, but 1, 2, 3, 4, let's say. And then Robert comes in and he tries to update it, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4 for the timestamp. So he says update. SQL Server says there is no blog ID of 5 with a timestamp of 1, 2, 3, 4. So 0 records returned. It's not an exception on the SQL Server side. It's just nothing happened, right? I got nothing to do, nothing to see, move along. So then EF Core, the change tracker says, hold on a minute. We're supposed to have one thing changed. We had nothing change. We're going to throw this DB update concurrency exception so you, the developer, can handle it. And you get that for free. I mean, why not turn it on?
Well, you have to decide
that's
how to handle it. That's why not to turn it on. And if your decision of how to handle it is, it's fine, just write it anyway, then there's no point in using it. But your point is very valid. It's certainly a very useful thing that you can just switch on and easily use. I absolutely agree.
And one more point about this. So we mentioned Dapper previously, and as you said, we all on the team love Dapper a lot. We're in touch with them, and we don't think people should absolutely use EF Core everywhere, and Dapper is great for a lot of uses. I think optimistic concurrency, though, and also connection resiliency are pretty good ideas, pretty good examples of stuff you get for free with EF Core. And it would be good if people would kind of think what they would have to go through to do the same kind of thing on Dapper. So where you get a much more low-level thing with much less kind of stuff like implemented for you for free. This is typically the kind of stuff, if you have to go Dapper and write your own SQL and do these kinds of things, you're going to end up, there may be a plugin out there for Dapper that does some of these things, so I might be, not totally correct here, but that's a good idea of the kind of added value that you get in EF Core.
Agreed. And I think given that Dapper, created by Stack Overflow, used by Stack Overflow, but they use EF Core, and basically I think Nick Craver has said in the past, for basically all of their updates, precisely because they don't want to get into the business of having to rewrite the ordering that the update pipeline does, the concurrency thing, all of the resiliency and everything. So even the creators of Dapper use EF Core basically to do when they need to update their database, because it saves you so much work.
Yeah, and the connection resiliency, in case you aren't familiar with it, the SQL Server team has defined a set of exceptions that are transient errors on the SQL Server side. So out of memory, too many connect, whatever, right? Something that SQL Server says, hey, if you try it again, we'll be fine. So if you just say enable retry on failure when you're setting up your options builder, then what EF Core will do, and it's configurable, but I believe the default is 5 tries starting at 100 milliseconds and sliding.
I don't remember the default. Sounds right.
Okay. Yeah, because I have 5 in my demo. So it will retry up to 5 times. And then if it fails after the 5th time, you actually get a retry limit exceeded exception. So from a developer standpoint, again, hey, SQL Server is getting hammered. How do I want to handle this, as opposed to just some random exception that didn't work? You can customize it, but why when SQL Server team gives us this for free?
My cat has heard Phil talking and wants to say hi. Hi, Phil.
Hey!
Cats are always welcome.
Interaction.
I don't have any
yeah.
cats today. I don't have
Arthur
cats.
usually has some in the background for his too.
Yeah.
So I've got the link to the show. There's obviously a lot more topics. We could probably spend a day on this. The view models, configuration. We talked about query filters, resiliency, computed columns, etc. So definitely check out this series. It's a great in-depth series, and I love that we talked about this, how it dispels some myths about Entity Framework Core. Thank you, Robert and Phil, for your time today. I know that you have a lot going on, so we appreciate having you on. And a big thanks, as usual, to our community, to our viewers, to everyone who helps support, who contributes, who gives us feedback, and who uses our products. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you on the next show. Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.